We're going to get started with our next session. Ooh, that quieted the crowd. Good afternoon. I am Jennifer Lowe. I'm MPAS Vice President of Shared Learning and Member Networks, and I'm really excited for this next session, Social Capital and Economic Mobility, where Dr. Raj Chetty is going to be talking about his recent research on that very topic. Raj Chetty is the William A. Ackman Professor of Economics at Harvard University. He's also the Director of Opportunity Insights, which uses big data to understand how we can give children from disadvantaged backgrounds better chances of succeeding. I encourage you to check out their website. There's some incredible reports and data to access. Dr. Chetty's research combines empirical evidence and economic theory to help design more effective government policies. His work on topics ranging from tax policy and unemployment insurance to education and affordable housing have been widely cited in academia, media outlets, and congressional testimony. Dr. Chetty received his PhD from Harvard University, and in 2003 is one of the youngest tenured professors in Harvard's history. Before joining the faculty at Harvard, he was a professor at UC Berkeley and Stanford University. Dr. Chetty has received numerous awards for his research, including the MacArthur Genius Award Fellowship and the John Bates Clark Medal, given to an economist under 40 whose work is judged to have the most significant impact in the field. Dr. Chetty is going to present for a bit, and then he's going to be joined by Dr. Dolores Acevedo Garcia for a fireside-style chat conversation. So Dr. Acevedo Garcia, whose work was referenced a bit in our last session by the Child Trends Report, so you already might have gotten a sneak peek on her research. She is the Samuel F. and Rose B. Gingold Professor of Human Development and Social Policy and the Director of the Institute for Child, Youth, and Family Policy at the Heller School for Social Policy and Management at Brandeis University. Her research focuses on the social determinants of racial, ethnic inequalities in health, the role of social policies in reducing those inequities, and the health and well-being of children with special needs. Dr. Acevedo Garcia received her BA in Public Administration from El Colegio de Mexico and her MPA, URP, and PhD in Public Policy with a concentration in Demography from the School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton University. Dr. Acevedo is the project director for DiversityDataKids.org, which is a comprehensive research program and indicator database on racial, ethnic, equity, and child well-being and opportunity across multiple sectors and geographies. So just as a reminder, we're going to have some audience Q&A after the fireside-style chat at the end of the session. So you'll have the opportunity to ask questions. For those in the audience, just be sure to raise your hand and we'll get a mic to you. And for those who are joining virtually, or for those in the audience, you can also enter your questions on the Whova app. We'll be monitoring that as well. So now I'd like to welcome, or actually if you all can join me in welcoming, Dr. Chetty to the stage.
Thanks so much for the warm introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here with all of you today doing, I think, what's incredibly important work to restore the American dream and create better opportunities for kids around the US. So I'm going to talk about some new work we've done in our research group that we put out a couple of months ago on the role of social capital and social connections in economic mobility, which I think you'll see very much connects with the types of approaches Empath takes, and I think increasingly seem very relevant in lots of different sectors in the United States. So to set the stage for this new work that I'm going to discuss, I want to start by talking about the geography of opportunity in America, drawing on some earlier research, and the role of place in determining children's life chances by talking about this map here. So let me first describe how we construct this map and then tell you what I think we learned from it. So in order to construct this map, what we did is took information from anonymized tax returns covering all kids born in the US in the early 1980s, about 20 million children. We link them to their parents and link them back to where they grew up and divide the US into 740 different metro and rural areas. And in each of those areas, we compute a very simple measure of upward mobility. We ask, what is the average income at age 35 for kids who grew up in low-income families in each of these areas? And by low income, I mean families at the 25th percentile of the national income distribution, which puts you at a household income of around $27,000 a year. So we take the set of kids who are growing up in families making about $27,000 a year, and we ask, how much are they themselves earning when they grow up, when they're 35 years old? We follow them no matter where they're living in the US at that point using the tax record data. We color the map so that blue-green colors represent areas where kids have better chances of rising out of poverty, where when you start out in a low-income family, you end up with a higher income on average. And red-orange colors represent areas with lower levels of upward mobility. So if you start by just looking at the scale in the lower right-hand side of this chart, you can see that there's an incredible amount of variation in America in children's chances of rising up. There are some parts of the country, like much of the rural Midwest, places like Dubuque, Iowa, where kids starting out in families making $27,000 a year, on average are making $45,000 or $50,000 one generation later. So that's a substantial amount of upward mobility in one generation. On the other hand, you have many other parts of the US, places like Charlotte, North Carolina, or much of the Southeast, cities in the industrial Midwest, where kids starting out in families at the exact same income level are ending up with average incomes of $26,000 or even below where their parents were in the previous generation, which is really surprising, I think, especially given the fact that there's been an enormous amount of economic growth in the US over the past 30 years when these kids were growing up. So it's kind of startling that they are not really benefiting from that. They're further behind where their parents were. So this map first shows us the importance of place in determining economic opportunity. If someone asks you, is the American dream alive today? The answer really depends upon which part of America you're talking about, or as I'll show you in a second, which specific neighborhoods you're talking about within a city. But second, from a researcher's perspective like myself, someone interested in understanding the science of economic opportunity, this kind of variation gives us a new lens to understand the determinants of economic opportunity. Think of it as sort of like having a microscope, which allows us to zoom in and ask, what is it that's different about Iowa versus Charlotte, North Carolina versus Salt Lake City? What can we learn from these differences about the determinants of economic opportunity and what we might be able to do going forward to increase opportunity for all? So motivated by that line of thinking, there's been a body of research that's emerged over the past 7 years or so since we put out this map and started to work with this data, where lots of researchers have used the data that we put out publicly and looked at many different factors that might explain the differences that you're seeing in this map. So people have identified factors like differences in poverty rates or inequality, racial segregation, issues related to family structure, the quality of schools. There are lots of different factors that seem to be highly predictive of these differences in economic mobility. One factor that lots of people have speculated might be very important is the idea of social capital, the strength of one's community, who you're interacting with. There's a lot of discussion in the literature in sociology and economics and public policy circles going back nearly 100 years that these kinds of factors could be very important. But measuring social capital has traditionally proven to be very challenging. And so really trying to distill, does social capital matter? What type of social capital matters? How might we change it going forward has been quite challenging. So motivated by that challenge, a few years ago, a group of colleagues and I decided to set about thinking about whether we could use sort of a modern big data approach, similar to what I was describing here, to measure social capital systematically. And we initiated a collaboration with Facebook and their research team to use the online social network data that Facebook has to measure social capital in a way that really hasn't been feasible in the past. And so what I'm going to discuss today is the result of that work and what we've learned about the role of social capital in improving economic mobility, and then end by talking about what that can mean for policies on the ground in terms of how we should be thinking about structuring what we do to increase opportunity going forward. So before I start to show you the data on social capital, the first step is to define what we actually mean by social capital to begin with. So if you look at this work that's been discussed over the years, there are lots of different notions of social capital that people have talked about. And we group them into 3 different types of categories that I think are useful to consider. So the first set of categories are what you might think of as measures of connectedness between different types of people. So for example, between high-income and low-income people, or it could be between people of different racial and ethnic backgrounds, or it could be between older people and younger people. So that's depicted by people shown in different colors in this diagram on the left, and then the lines show friendships between people. And the question is, for example, to what extent are low and high-income people interacting in a given community? That's one way we might think about social capital. A different way you could think about social capital is to forget about the characteristics of people and just ask about the extent to which a network in a given community is fragmented into separate cliques versus being very cohesive. So we think of these as measures of cohesiveness. To what extent is it the case that everyone in this room is friends with everyone else, or is it that there are different sort of subgroups that may be friends with each other but are not interacting, across those groups? And so that's a second way to think about social capital, how tight-knit is a community, not necessarily thinking about interaction across class lines or racial lines, but just the structure of the network itself. And then a final way to think about social capital that people have talked about over the years, popularized starting in some early work by my colleague at Harvard, Bob Putnam, in a book, Bowling Alone, that many of you might know, are ideas of civic engagement. So forgetting about these networks, how much are people volunteering? Are they participating in local organizations? Do they trust each other? Things like that. So with the Facebook data, we construct new measures of all of these different types of social capital and have released them publicly by zip code. And they can then be used to understand the importance of these types of social capital for lots of different questions. I'm going to focus today on one of those social capital measures that turns out to be extremely important in explaining these differences in economic mobility that I started out with on that initial slide. And that is a measure of what I'm going to call economic connectedness, which is simply measuring the extent to which low and high income people are interacting with each other in a given community. So specifically, what we're doing in this map is taking the set of Facebook users, about 70 million people between the ages of 25 and 44 in the United States. And we're asking, among the below median income people on Facebook in a given county, what fraction of their friends are above median income, are high income? And we colored this map so that blue-green colors represent places with more cross-class connection, where lower income folks have more high-income friends, and red colors represent places where there's more disconnection across class lines. So if you look at this map, you might recognize immediately that there's a real similarity to the first map that I showed you of economic mobility, that same kind of pattern with the rural Midwest having much more cross-class connection, the Southeast being lower, and so on. And so we can look at that more systematically by plotting those two data sets against each other. So here we're showing for the 200 largest counties in America, the data on upward mobility constructed from the tax records a few years ago on the vertical axis against the data on economic connectedness, which we put out a couple months ago from the Facebook data. And you can see these two things are incredibly strongly correlated. Places where you have more interaction across class lines tend to be places where kids growing up in low-income families have better chances of rising up out of poverty. So I'm going to say more about why that might be and what the implications of that are in a second. But let me just point out that I've honed in on one particular measure of social capital of the many different types that I talked about at the beginning. And the reason for that is if you then ask, you can do this kind of analysis correlating upward mobility with many different measures of social capital, not just economic connectedness, which I just showed you, but connectedness across age lines, other measures of the structure of a network, what are called clustering measures, how tight-knit a network is, how much people are volunteering, things like that. And it turns out there's a very clear pattern in the data. There's one and only one measure of social capital that really seems to predict economic mobility, and that's this economic connectedness measure, the degree of cross-class interaction. Now, all these other measures of social capital, that's not to say they're irrelevant. They could be important for other types of outcomes, maybe health outcomes or other things that we care about. But for economic mobility, it really looks quite clear that it's this cross-class interaction variable that we should be focused on. So I showed you the data just now at the county level. Let me now give you another example at the zip code level. And just to give you a flavor for how this works, I just want to show how folks can use this tool. I'm going to toggle over to this website, socialcapital.org, where you can access all of these data for your own community if you're interested. And the way this works is very much like a Google map. You can type in any address you're interested in. I'm just going to type in Boston, given where we are. And we can zoom in and look at the data now, neighborhood by neighborhood here in Boston, the same kind of measures that I was just talking about. Where are lower income folks interacting more with high income folks? You can see that's much lower in places like Dorchester and Roxbury, higher in places like Somerville, some of the northern parts of the city, and so on. And so you can look at these measures and various other measures of social capital for your own communities. And so going back to the slides, I'm going to give you an example here from Los Angeles, where you see that map of economic connectedness on the right from the socialcapital.org website. It's just a snapshot of that for the LA area. And then on the map, on the left is a zip code level map of rates of upward mobility. What are kids' chances of rising out of poverty by zip code in LA? And once again, you can see at the zip code level, those two maps look super similar to each other. There's a really tight connection between those two things. So to take one example, central LA, which as you all know, places like Watts and Compton, high poverty areas that have faced a lot of challenges over the years, these are places where low-income folks are very disconnected from high-income people and might be disconnected from opportunities in various ways. And those are also places where we see some of the lowest rates of upward mobility in America. Okay, so one potential explanation for why we see this connection between these two variables is that economic connections actually matter for kids' life outcomes. Why might they matter? It could be because they shape kids' aspirations. If you're around folks who've gone to college or pursuing certain career paths that you yourself have not seen in your own family, maybe that changes what you choose to do. You might change what you do in school, the types of careers you choose to pursue, and so forth. It could also be about direct networks, getting an internship, getting a job referral, if you're connected to more folks and in companies that can give you access to those kinds of resources that can make a difference. So all of those mechanisms, I think, could be quite important. But there's also a completely different set of explanations, which is maybe it's about a different set of factors entirely that are explaining this correlation between these two variables. So in particular, as we just discussed, places like Compton and Watts are some of the poorest communities in America. Part of the reason low-income folks there have so few high-income friends is that you tend to be friends with the people around you. And if there are no high-income people, kind of living nearby, you're not going to have a lot of contact with folks from higher-income backgrounds. But it could well be that it's actually just the poverty in those communities that's having a direct negative effect on rates of upward mobility. The schools don't have that much funding. There are lots of other resources that may be lacking. So maybe it's not actually directly the economic connectedness factor. Maybe it's these other things that are related to poverty that matter. So what I want to show you next is how we can disentangle those two explanations, kind of the correlation explanation versus the causal explanation. And to do that, I'm going to turn to this chart here, which is what I see as one of the central findings from the new research. So just to set this up in a series of steps, the first thing I'm going to do is plot these measures of economic connectedness, now shown on the vertical axis, versus the median household income in the zip code. So each dot here represents a different zip code in America, okay? And you can see there's an upward sloping relationship there. In general, richer zip codes tend to have more connection between low-income people and high-income people. And that, is a simple consequence of what I was just saying, that if you live around higher income folks, you're going to tend to have more high income friends. So that makes sense intuitively. But you can see there's a lot of dispersion at any given level of income. There are some places where there's more economic connectedness, more interaction across class lines. There are other places where there's less. And so now, exploiting that, I'm going to get to the key point, which is to color these dots by the rates of upward mobility that you were seeing from the Opportunity Atlas tax data. And remember, the red colors represent places where kids from low-income backgrounds are less likely to rise up, and the blue-green colors represent places where kids from low-income backgrounds are more likely to rise up, all right? So what you see when you do this analysis is, I think, a very striking and clear pattern, which is if you take any vertical slice of this data, so you look at a set of communities, all of which, say, have household incomes of around $50,000 a year, if you look at the communities where low-income folks are not interacting with high-income folks, at the bottom of this vertical slice, you see very low rates of upward mobility there. But as you move up, you see the colors change systematically from red to blue, showing that holding fixed the level of income in a given area, as you have more cross-class interaction, you're seeing systematically higher levels of upward mobility. But now if you do the converse exercise, suppose you take a horizontal slice of the data, take a bunch of places that vary dramatically in how rich they are, but they all have the same level of cross-class interaction, you can see that there's basically no change in the colors as you're going from left to right. So what do you learn from that analysis? What really seems to be important is the extent to which low and high income folks are connected to each other, not necessarily the level of poverty or the level of resources in an area. And so this kind of analysis, and we do many other such analyses, it really looks like this factor of cross-class interaction is a key predictor of economic mobility. And to put it in simple terms, having studied this issue for many years, this is the single strongest predictor we've identified to date of differences in economic mobility across places, and it explains a lot of the earlier patterns that people had found in prior research. Okay, so given that result, the next thing that you might be wondering, and we were curious about, is what is it that makes some of these places have more interaction across class lines than others? And how might you be able to create more such interaction going forward through changes in policy, through changes in what nonprofit organizations are doing, and things like that? And so to get at that, I want to talk about two different ways, two different factors that contribute to economic connectedness. The first is what I'm going to call exposure, or just segregation by income. So to give you a concrete example of what I mean by that, imagine that you have two different schools, and in school A, you have all the high-income kids, and in school B, you have all the low-income kids. So if you have this kind of situation, you're going to have a very disconnected society because you can't be friends with people you don't meet. And so this lack of exposure or high levels of segregation could potentially be leading to economic disconnection in some places. So that's one possibility. But there's a very different possibility as well that could be happening, which is what we're calling friending bias, a potential lack of interaction, even conditional on exposure. So consider the illustration on the right, where you've got the same two pair of schools, but now they're perfectly integrated. You've got the same number of low and high income kids in both schools, but you still don't have any cross-class friendships. And it's because in that example, the high-income kids are all hanging out with each other and the low-income kids are all hanging out with each other, even though they are physically in the same school. So distinguishing between these two explanations is extremely important for policy, because if it's about exposure, then we need to think about how we integrate environments. How do we have more diverse schools? How do we do things like changes in zoning, could be busing, changes in school district boundaries, thinking about institutions of higher education, how do we admit a more diverse student body, things like that. But if it's about friending bias, that's not the relevant issue. You've got to think about why in your potentially very diverse school, your very diverse community, you still don't have interaction across class lines. So what we do in this research is try to understand the relative importance of these two factors in explaining the social disconnection that we see in America. Using the Facebook data, we're able to figure out where people became friends, school by school, college by college, church by church, and figure out how much of the social disconnection is due to exposure versus friending bias. And the answer, I'm just going to jump to the punchline, is that it's basically 50-50. Half of the social disconnection between low and high income people in the US is due to the fact that we go to different schools, we live in different neighborhoods, and so on. But the remaining half is due to friending bias. And the implication of that is that even if we were to somehow manage to integrate every single school, every single neighborhood, every single college, which would obviously be incredibly difficult to do, even then, we would have half of the social disconnection left, which highlights the importance of tackling friending bias going forward. Now, I've been showing you a lot of statistics and numbers, but I just want to emphasize that the idea here is really quite simple, and I think is something people have observed in their own lives, and I just want to give you an illustration of that. Here's a quote from Carmelo Anthony's recent memoir, where he talks about his experience growing up in Baltimore, and he talks about how millionaires could live on one side of a street and the projects could be on the other side. So at some level, physically, there's integration in this community. You've got low and high income people living proximate to each other. But he notes those two worlds would never cross, never make friends, never acknowledge each other. Everybody was okay with it, especially the rich. And that's basically what we're seeing in these data what we're calling friending bias, that you can have people physically in basically the same communities, but that doesn't necessarily guarantee that you're going to get the type of connection that seems to be very strongly associated with economic mobility. Okay, so what does that mean in terms of what you might actually be able to do about these issues? So I want to emphasize that in the same way that in the policy conversation, we think about exposure and segregation as something that we can at least try to have an impact on by changing, say, zoning, multifamily zoning, things like that. Friending bias also is something that is influenced by policy choices and institutional choices that we can make. So to give you an illustration of that, I want to show that friending bias is not just determined by people's sort of innate preferences, it's determined very much by the context and the circumstances in which people are meeting each other. So as one illustration, we can look at how this degree of friending bias, the degree to which people are not interacting with people from different class backgrounds, varies across the settings in which friendships are made. And what you can see is there's a really systematic pattern where friending bias is much higher in certain settings, like neighborhoods, relative to other types of settings like recreational groups or religious groups, where concretely what we basically see is the types of friends people make in their churches are much more likely to cut across class lines than the types of friends the same exact people make in their schools or in their neighborhoods and so on. So that's just to show that it really matters where you are connecting with people. As another example, the size of the group has a really big effect on friending bias. So schools that are larger tend to exhibit much higher levels of friending bias than small schools. And there's a very intuitive explanation for that that's been documented in prior work in sociology as well, that in large groups, people kind of tend to look for people who are similar to them, and you get a lot of separation. If you go to a dinner party with 10 people, you will probably talk to everyone by the end of the evening. And that phenomenon plays out very clearly in these data. And it has, I think, a really tangible implication, which is perhaps having smaller schools or smaller cohorts within schools could have a real impact on how people are interacting and on downstream outcomes. So the point here is that friending bias can itself potentially be changed. We've put out data publicly school by school where you can look at for each school in America, schools in your own city, do they have high levels of friending bias or not? Or is the issue more a lack of exposure? And you can kind of figure out which dimension you want to target. And there are a number of initiatives that people are already trying to undertake to reduce friending bias, from reducing the amount of tracking and divisions within schools in a place like the Berkeley Public High School, which is incredibly diverse but exhibits a lot of friending bias, to other types of programs, which I'm happy to talk about in the discussion, but won't go into detail on here. So in the last couple of minutes, I want to make one final broad point here, which is one lesson that you could take from this new analysis is that we should devote effort directly to trying to increase cross-class interaction. And I think that can be very valuable through changes in exposure, through trying to reduce friending bias, as I was just talking about, and so on. But I think there are also implications for other types of programs that are already being implemented that don't fundamentally have to do with building social capital. And so I want to quickly illustrate that to you and how we're thinking about that in our own research group by talking about some quick examples of areas in which we're studying interventions that are showing great success, all of which have a theme of kind of providing people social capital above and beyond just giving them financial resources. And so there are many different domains that one can focus on. In our research group, we're doing work on trying to reduce segregation, on making place-based investments in the areas that currently offer low levels of economic opportunity, in the higher education space, and so on. Let me just pick a couple of examples in the interest of time. I'm going to spend a minute here talking about the reducing segregation approach. So just to give you a sense of what we're doing here, here's a snapshot from the Opportunity Atlas data on upward mobility in the Seattle area, where you see that there are some parts of Seattle where kids who grow up in low-income families don't have great chances of rising up, and there are other parts where they do much better, a pattern that you see in cities across America. Now, what we've done in this map is overlaid in the bright green dots the most common places where families receiving housing vouchers from the federal government currently live. And you'll notice what might be a puzzling pattern, which is despite the fact that these families are getting about $1,500 a month of rental assistance from the government, those green dots are concentrated primarily in the red and orange colored parts of the map and not the blue-green colored parts of the map. So despite the fact that we're spending about $45 billion a year on affordable housing programs in the US, we're not actually helping families move to the types of neighborhoods that are going to break the cycle of poverty across generations. So when we noticed this pattern, when we put out these data, and folks in the Housing and Urban Development Agency and the Seattle and King County housing authorities remarked upon this pattern, we began to wonder, why is that? And could we potentially make a difference in supporting families and moving to different neighborhoods if they wanted to? And so what we did is designed a pilot intervention, which we implemented through a randomized trial in collaboration with the Seattle Housing Authority, which took 1,000 families receiving housing vouchers and gave 500 of them randomly selected essentially some additional social support to use the housing voucher. Connected them with counselors who would help them find housing in neighborhoods that are higher opportunity, connected them to landlords, provided a little bit of financial assistance to pay things like application fees if they needed it, basically tried to remove some of the barriers they might face in moving to opportunity. We ran this as a randomized trial, so you can just compare what happened in the control group and the treatment group. And you can see that in the control group, only 14% of families ended up moving to a high opportunity area, one of the blue-green colored parts of the map that I just showed you. But that number jumped to 55% in the treatment group, showing that this simple intervention was actually not that expensive relative to the cost of the voucher. Providing this additional social support fundamentally changes the impact of the program. We estimate, based on our prior work, that the kids who were randomly assigned to the treatment group are on average going to go on to earn about $200,000 more over their lifetimes relative to the kids in the control group, showing the power of this sort of intervention. Now, that exercise in Seattle is now being scaled across the United States. There was a bill passed in Congress authorizing funding to replicate what we did in Seattle in 9 other cities across the US, and that's happening at the moment. And there's now a bipartisan bill working its way through Congress to expand the Housing Choice Voucher Program, importantly, with these sorts of social supports to try to expand opportunity and expand access to better neighborhoods going forward, building off of exactly these themes. So I focus on that example not so much to say that moving to opportunity housing vouchers are necessarily the key to increasing economic mobility. I think they can be one tool, but there are lots of other things that in some ways I think are more scalable and potentially more effective, because you can't possibly move everyone to a different neighborhood and not everyone wants to move. I focus on that example because it illustrates how we can take an existing program and use these insights that social connections and social support matters a lot to greatly amplify the impacts of the $45 billion we're already spending. The same thing goes in the other sectors as well. So in the context of place-based investments, when we put out some of this data, as I pointed out earlier, Charlotte, North Carolina is one of the cities with the lowest levels of upward mobility in the United States. When we put out that fact publicly a few years ago, folks in Charlotte reacted by wondering, why is that the case? This is really a wake-up call for our city. They set up a commission and a task force bringing together local business leaders and policymakers to try to figure out how can we improve opportunities for low-income kids growing up in our own city. And as an example of what happened as a result of that, which I think can be very effective, is Bank of America, which is headquartered in Charlotte, committed to hiring 1,000 people from local communities in Charlotte from disadvantaged backgrounds to actually give them pathways to these high-paying jobs that Bank of America was creating in the city. And the way they did that was by teaming up with actually a Boston-based group, Year Up, which many of you might know is a sectoral job training program. And Year Up, it's been shown in prior randomized trials and some work we're doing with them following people's earnings over time, looking at people who participated in the Year Up program in the green versus people who didn't. People who get access to the one-year Year Up mentorship and job training program end up having much better outcomes in the long run relative to people who didn't. And once again, the reason I show this here is that it echoes the theme that I'm talking about, that there's a long history of job training programs in the US going back to the 1980s and 1990s, where we've seen lots of disappointing results. But the new programs that are showing a strong record of success are exactly these programs that not only give you technical skills, like training in IT or something like that, but also mentorship, a set of connections to employers who want to hire you. They have this kind of social support, social capital aspect to them that seems really critical. So let me end by just summarizing with, ending with some broad implications. As you can see, what I've been discussing here, I think very much connects with the type of work that Empath's doing that I think a lot of you are focused on. Some takeaways from this very broad body of research that's now developed using the tools of big data. I think first, local childhood environment really plays a central role in shaping prospects for upward mobility. Second, as I've been emphasizing here in this latest work, social psychological forces really seem central. We need to focus on social support above and beyond financial resources, which is usually what the policy debate is about. And finally, as I hope I've illustrated here, I think the tools of big data, some of these data sets that we've released publicly will hopefully be helpful to all of you as you do the important work you're doing in figuring out how we should target interventions at specific schools, colleges, communities, and our team would certainly be very happy to help in assisting with those efforts. So let me stop there, and thanks so much. It is. You just need to bring it closer.
That was a great presentation. I read. I can't hear you. Is this okay now? Thank you. That was a great presentation. I read both papers, all the technical appendices, look at the supplemental data, and I still found it very useful to hear your presentation about these very interesting findings. So as I think everyone here knows, Dr. Chetty has been highly influential in improving our collective understanding of social inequality in the US over the last decade or so. I myself have benefited tremendously from his research. As was mentioned during the introduction, I'm also very interested in issues of neighborhood segregation and child poverty. And actually, for my own work, we also have an index that we call the Child Opportunity Index. We have used the Opportunity Atlas data to validate the index and to construct some weights for the index. So I think the field as a whole, academics and other people as well, practitioners like the housing mobility people, everyone has benefited tremendously from your research. I want to start by making some connections between the first presentation that we heard today from Dana and Renee and your presentation. So one of the things that everyone knows, of course, is that the title of the conference today is Disrupting Poverty, right? And poverty and economic mobility, they are related concepts, but they are not the same, right? And we heard in the morning that we thankfully have very, very effective policies and programs in the US to reduce poverty, and the earned income tax credit, for example, is one of them. We also heard that we have persistent inequities in child poverty, and they are ingrained in some of our programs. To give a quick example that was kindly mentioned by Renee and Dana in the morning, we recently looked at the EITC, and as it was mentioned this morning, one of the restrictions in the EITC is that children, US citizen children of parents that do not have a social security number cannot access the EITC at all. As a result of this restriction, among other things, these children have very high poverty rates of 30% or higher. And we have estimated using some of the same simulation models that we're using for the roadmap report by National Academies that was also mentioned earlier, that if we were to eliminate the social security number restrictions in the EITC, these children, US citizen children in families that do not have social security numbers, we would reduce their poverty rate by 30%, and we would lift about 500,000 children out of poverty. Dr. Chetty, you, Raj, have done research on so many things over the years. You also look at the EITC, and you did some wonderful research about the causal effects of the EITC, showing that the EITC has effects on improving academic achievement outcomes for kids and, in turn, future earnings. So I wanted to, again, trying to link your presentation and Dana and Renee's from this morning to tell us a little bit about the context of federal policies to reduce child poverty today, And what you see as some of the most effective and promising practices things that we already have in place, federal policy that we already have in place, and how we could improve them, enhance them, tweak them to be more effective, especially for reducing inequities.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be able to join Dr. Acevedo Garcia on the stage here. And this is a very important and complex question that has a lot of aspects to it. So first, let me just echo that there is an important distinction between poverty rates in a given generation and intergenerational mobility out of poverty, which is what I was focused on. Obviously, the two are linked. But just to make crystal clear what I see as the distinction, when we're thinking about poverty rates in a given generation, if we have something like the expansion of the child tax credit or the earned income tax credit, mechanically, we're going to lift people out of poverty in a given generation. That in and of itself is, I think, incredibly valuable, because having people grow up in poverty, live in poverty is not an outcome I think any of us really want. Then separately, there's a question of, if we lift somebody out of poverty in the current generation, is that going to persist in the next generation, even if we didn't continue that program, right? Are they going to have a higher level of earnings themselves? Are they going to kind of become self-sufficient at some level? And your question essentially gets at that. And what my sense is that there are certain programs where, through cash transfers, like the earned income tax credit, there can be situations where giving people more resources, as you'd expect intuitively, their kids face less stress, they maybe have better nutrition, they have access to better environments. That all can have a payoff in the next generation. But unfortunately, I think the picture is more complex than just giving people money and lifting people out of poverty in a given generation, because there are now a number of other studies in economics and other fields showing that in other contexts, cash transfers, especially unconditional cash transfers, don't always lead to the money being spent in ways that directly benefit kids in the next generation. And so there's nice work done, for example, by Esther Duflo at MIT, showing that if you give money, for example, to moms versus dads, or give money for education versus for other things, it gets spent in very different ways. Often you find that money given to mothers specifically, or to grandmothers, ends up benefiting children much more than money given to fathers, which gets spent very differently. And so the reason I make those points is, I think we need to, giving people resources and lifting people out of poverty in a given generation is an important goal in and of its own right. But if we want to have an impact on intergenerational poverty, I think that can be part of the toolkit, but we need to be doing more than that as well, which is what brings me to some of the themes that I was emphasizing here. When you give people resources, like say in the form of a housing voucher, you need to actually equip them with the tools to use that housing voucher effectively. When you give people access to financial aid for higher education, you need to actually give people the tools to apply to colleges where they're going to have the best outcomes and use that financial aid. And so I would argue we need to go beyond that type of cash investment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Just to add some more information, I think that it's very important that unconditional cash transfers can have a very important effect on child well-being. We know from research on the EITC, that is causal research, extremely rigorous, including your own research, that they can improve health and education outcomes for kids, and even longer-term outcomes like earnings in adulthood. And we have some very compelling research, also causal experimental research recently, like the Baby's First Year study by my colleague Greg Duncan and others, that shows that those unconditional cash transfers can even influence brain development in early childhood. So I think that you're absolutely right that we have to keep doing both. I want to talk a little bit about the issue of segregation that you touched upon, and I am very glad that you did. So one of the things that is wonderful about your work is that in addition to the huge academic success that you've had, it's also received a lot of coverage in the media, right? So it's, in a way, it's accessible, but I also worry that it's obviously incredibly rigorous and it's very complex methodologically, it's very nuanced in terms of the construct, the time frames, the geographic levels. So sometimes people oversimplify the findings, right? So to give an example, one headline from the New York Times was something like, for reducing poverty, key factor is more friendships between rich and poor. So that sounds a little naive, and obviously that's not what you're saying at all, as we just heard. So one issue related to that is how some people are interpreting the importance of residential segregation and other forms of segregation, school, segregation in early childhood, et cetera. So we just heard that if you reduce your analysis to the bottom line, about 50% of the difference in economic connectedness is due to segregation, and about 50% is due to what you call friending bias, right? So to give another statistic from your study that I found very compelling, you say that among zip codes, 73% of the difference in economic connectedness between the bottom 20% of zip codes in terms of economic connectedness and the top 23% is exposure, right? Difference is, explained by segregation, essentially. You also give some other really shocking information, such as that low-income people make the majority of their friends in neighborhoods, and also that they have very restricted exposure in neighborhoods, right? So all those issues are speaking in one way or another to segregation, and that's why you find this incredibly important part that is 50%. But the friending bias, I was also thinking, and you allude to one of the factors, friending bias could be reflecting segregation at a lower scale, right? So you were saying, and I think that that's an example that anyone who's living in the suburbs and has sent their kids to the schools in the suburbs knows this example of you have semi-integrated schools racially or economically, but then kids are tracking to completely different systems within schools. But in addition to that, we have such incredibly high levels of segregation across different settings in society that I think that we have grown lazy and accustomed to not being able to interact with each other. Mm-hmm. So even friending bias, I think, maybe is related to segregation that we've had for so many decades, right? So I absolutely don't say that you are saying that, but often your research is interpreted as that. So I would love this opportunity for you to clarify for all of us how important is segregation and how much we can keep fighting to reduce it, and not only for economic mobility reasons, for other reasons such as civil rights and fair housing.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. I agree with everything you said, and I think exposure or segregation is incredibly important. And as you're noting, it may itself drive what we're calling friending bias down the road. It may, at a micro level, be the reason you see friending bias. So one example of a study that comes to my mind that speaks to some of these issues is by my colleague Gautam Rao at Harvard, where he looks at the effects of this kind of interaction across class lines, not on the low-income kids, but on the high-income kids, on their attitudes and their outcomes. And he looks at some data from India where they have an experiment where kids effectively are exposed to more kids from different backgrounds or not. And he shows that when kids from higher income backgrounds are more exposed to kids from lower income families, their own attitudes change substantially going forward. They become more charitable, they become more supportive of redistributive policies, they themselves form different types of connections down the road. And that is one example of the type of phenomenon you're describing, where I think segregation, which starts at a very early age, before kids really even enter school, and is built into our society in so many different ways, I think understanding how we tackle that is incredibly important. I think at the same time we need to recognize that segregation is a combination of policy decisions and choices that individual families are making. And we need to be very cognizant of how we set things up to make it attractive for people to want to live in integrated environments rather than just trying to do something that's then going to lead to white flight or other kinds of responses in equilibrium. So it's clearly a complex issue to tackle.
Yeah, no, of course. Thank you. And we don't have much time because we want to leave 10 minutes for questions from all of you. But I have one question that I also want to ask. I'm going to try to be really brief. So another way in which your research, and again, this is misinterpretation of your findings, is sometimes read, especially by conservatives, is the question of the importance of race or the importance of single-parent households. I remember one Twitter exchange, Chris Winship from the American Enterprise Institute and some of his colleagues, and they were kind of celebrating what they call one of your sleeper findings. And they were saying that essentially one of them tried to summarize your findings. Obviously, that was their own responsibility, saying something like, the key to economic mobility is move to a place where there are no black people and there are no single-headed households. So that is obviously an extremely dangerous way in which some people are trying to present this, which is not at all what you are saying. But statistically, and of course, statistics have many limitations, we cannot really tell antecedents, determinants, mechanisms, show that those two variables are important. So your research is incredibly nuanced and important. I want you to have an opportunity to explain why people that are saying that are not interpreting your results correctly, because I don't think they are.
Yeah. So first, what are the statistical facts in the data? So I showed that there's a very strong correlation with the degree of economic connectedness. What other people have also noticed, and is in fact a correlation in the data, is that there's a very strong relationship with the share of single parents in an area and with racial shares as well. Not quite as strong as the relationships you see with economic connectedness, but they are clearly also strong correlations. Okay, so how do we understand those correlations? All of these factors are interrelated to each other. And so it makes it difficult to unpack exactly what the mechanisms are, which is what I think leads to some of those potentially dangerous interpretations, as you put it. So first, in the context of racial shares, there's an old finding in the literature that has been confirmed many times that neighborhoods that are more segregated, neighborhoods with predominantly black populations, tend to have lower rates of upward mobility. That fact turns out to be entirely explained by differences in economic connectedness. So just like I showed you for the poverty rates with that colored dot chart, it turns out if you do the same kind of analysis for racial segregation, once you control for economic connectedness, there is no connection between racial segregation and, or the share of black people in an area and rates of upward mobility. And to me, that makes a lot of sense intuitively. We have very disconnected communities in America that tend to be predominantly black, and I think it's that lack of connection, lack of opportunity that is hampering upward mobility in those places, not the racial composition of the place in and of itself. Now on single parent shares, the picture is a little bit more complicated, and this is what Scott Winship was picking up on, that there is a strong correlation with single parent shares even after you control for economic connectedness. But it turns out, and this is not in the papers, but it's something you could reproduce with our publicly available data, if you look specifically at rates of upward mobility for white folks or for black folks, that is, you control for race at the individual level, you once again find that single parent shares become a much weaker predictor, and economic connectedness really remains a very strong predictor of mobility, conditional on race. And so what's happening there is, as you all know, rates of single parent shares vary dramatically by race. So there are many more single parent families among black Americans than white Americans. We all know that there are sharp differences in economic mobility by race for various reasons related to discrimination, historical factors, et cetera. And if you don't control for race, then you're going to find a link between these variables that probably doesn't reflect the way in which it's being interpreted. So thank you for pointing out that there's quite a bit of subtlety in how to interpret these data.
Yeah, no, I encourage people to really read the papers because the learning experience of reading the whole paper and looking at some of the technical documentation is incredible. So thank you for all the work you've done. And my role now is to see whether you have questions, and someone is going to help us with the app.
Hi. So all of us here, probably buy into the importance of lifting kids of parents without Social Security numbers out of poverty through, for example, the Earned Income Tax Credit. But as we know, people in power who can change those policies don't always have that same level of buy-in. And we also know that poverty can cost the community in other ways. Is anybody currently looking at whether the cost of expanding the Earned Income Tax Credit is offset by savings in other areas to the community to kind of convince those who have more of a, spending mindset and see that expense as not worth it?
Yeah. So thanks for that. I mean, if you take kind of a pure dollars and cents view, you don't necessarily care about equity, or suppose one has that extreme view. Even then, as you're pointing out, it could make sense to invest in some of these programs because they can potentially pay for themselves. And so in fact, my colleague at Harvard, Nathan Hendren, has done some nice work trying to quantify for hundreds of different programs what is the return to the government from investing in these programs. Setting aside equity considerations, how much of your money do you kind of get back, given that you have to spend less on transfer payments, you get more tax revenues down the road because people are earning more money and so on. And the basic punchline is that programs targeted at kids, at the human capital development of kids that put them on better trajectories, many of them do in fact end up paying for themselves. Programs targeted at adults, less so, partly because that's not often their intention. But the key point is that, I don't know about necessarily the EITC itself, but the broad suite of programs, things like SNAP, programs that directly provide assistance to families with kids, many of them do have a very large rate of return. And so that's a different way to rationalize why we should be investing more in these things.
Thank you. I wish we didn't have to think about it in those terms, but for some people it can be convincing.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that for the EITC, again, some of the strongest causal research evidence that we have is for the EITC, and we know that it can improve health, education, earnings, etc. So someone should quantify that specifically for the EITC and put that into dollars that we could save from providing access now. Another aspect is obviously the demographic importance of children in immigrant families. Overall, this group of children is 25% of children growing up in America today. And among children in poverty, these children are a very, very important fraction. So it's kind of like an obvious point that in the end, these children are here. They are citizens, the vast majority of them, like 90%. So we are investing in our own future if we invest in them. So someone needs to be able to articulate those economic arguments in a more compelling way, absolutely.
Question. Where I come from in Ohio, small town, I was looking at the chart. It's like 34.9%. Now, where we're from, it's not an African-American issue because it's only 9% African-American and another 4% mix, which would be considered African-American. So we see, 35%. And so it's not just a black and white, but poverty. But what I've found, just through observation, this proves it, that the people that make the decisions, the politicians, the business owners, the people that plan any events in our town, keeps it on the other side of town. And it's almost like you systemically are separating people. And, I don't know if that's a comment or how do we attack that?
Yeah, I'm glad to hear, at some level that these data seem to resonate with your experience. I think you point out a very important challenge, which is, it echoes what I was saying, that some of these disconnections are not just emerging because people don't want to connect with folks from other backgrounds, but the way in which events are being held or how things are being organized. Sometimes the path of least resistance is to not change the way things were done in the past, and that leads to kind of the perpetuation of these kinds of separations. I think the first step is just to recognize that that's happening, and then through the efforts of what some of these organizations are trying to do to deliberately cut across class lines and make those kinds of connections, my hope is that one will see a change going forward, and one can potentially measure those changes with these types of data as well going forward to know where we're making progress and where we need to do more.
Hi. So, you mentioned policies. So my question is around credit rating. Credit is king. And you may have that voucher, right, for that subsidy or that apartment, but if you don't have a 730 credit,
Yep.
You're not getting into that neighborhood.
Yep.
And when I look at Compton, that's what I think. I'm like, well, these people most likely, the credit rating is low. Nobody's going to rent outside of Compton.
Yeah.
So they're going to have to live there. So is there anything that's being done about that?
Yeah. So credit certainly matters. One of the things we saw in Seattle, and that's part of the reason for designing that intervention, is, as you note, a lot of the people who are applying for housing vouchers in Seattle don't necessarily have great credit. And so part of the reason I think that program we implemented worked, we weren't directly changing people's credit ratings, obviously, but I think the counselors were able to come in with the clients and say, yes, this person may not have the perfect credit record that you'd be looking for, but here's our sense of why they're on a different track now. They've got a stable job. They're kind of in a different part of their life. And we are going to kind of vouch for them and make the case that this is going to work out. And What we were reassured to see in the follow-up data is that not only did these folks move to higher opportunity neighborhoods at much higher rates, but they were able to stay there for many years going forward. And moreover, even after this experimental program ended, landlords began to approach the Seattle and King County housing authorities saying, we actually really liked the tenants that you were able to connect us with. Can you give us more such tenants? And so I say that not to say that credit is not important. I think figuring out how we can help people develop better credit profiles can be very valuable for lots of things. But it goes to show you that even short of that, there are other things we can do that can help people get on a track, which down the road is now going to help improve their credit, right? If they've had this place and are paying their rent and so on. So I think it's sort of a cycle where if you're never given the opportunity to build your credit, to build that profile, you're never going to break out of the cycle. And these kinds of interventions can hopefully make a difference.
Thank you, Raj and Dolores, for this conversation this afternoon. I am from Bexar County, Texas, one of the most red-line communities in the state of Texas. I want to talk a little more about friending bias. I have 2 children in a suburban high school. I can tell you friending bias is very much alive and well. So my question for you, Raj, is what social scientists do you follow? And can you just talk a little bit more about the impacts as we think about economic mobility?
Yeah, so there are many sociologists who've been interested in these kinds of issues of friending bias and what leads to it, both along income lines, but particularly in the past along racial lines, which of course continue to be extremely important in many settings in the US. You asked about impacts and what can be done about it. That really, of course, is the key question. Our sense is there is an impact of these kinds of things. I briefly threw up a slide with some examples of the types of things people are trying to tackle friending bias, which range from in the Berkeley Public High School, rather than putting kids into separate tracks right in 9th grade, creating what they call hives, which are smaller groups of students that are deliberately coming from different class lines, from different racial backgrounds, cutting across different tracks to try to create these types of connections. There are efforts to change the architecture of schools so that students who normally would be in different parts of the building are actually meeting with each other. There are recreational groups that might break down some of these barriers. We're seeing lots of programs that basically try to find a common denominator which takes away class markers and other things that might lead to separation. So an example would be, what I was talking about with religious organizations. Why do we see so little friending bias in religious organizations? I don't think we know for sure, but one hypothesis is that people in religious organizations feel they have something in common that brings them together. And independent of class or other things, there's something to connect around. And so I think creating those kinds of settings to a greater degree could potentially make a difference. Now, to be honest, all of that is a little bit speculative because I think we don't yet have very clear evidence on which of these approaches actually works. That's something that I hope will happen in the field given this sort of work in the coming years.
Okay, so that's our signal that we are done with this session. And thank you very much for attending. And I think there is is there another one? Yeah. Okay, do you want to close?
Thank you.
Dr. Chetty, Dr. Acevedo, Garcia, thank you again for this wonderful session. We so appreciate you being here with us and all of the wonderful ideas for us to percolate on over these coming days. So we are going to go into a short break. So bathrooms are around the corner to the right. We will be coming back at 3:15 for our final session of the day. And just a reminder, folks, within the app to please evaluate things as you go. So if you click on the session, there's a rate button, and you can just give us a little rating and any feedback that you have at all. Thanks.